Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Hidden Treasures. I'm your host, Jim Cousins, along with the president of the Historical Society in Hopkinton, John Palmer, who brings you really interesting stories and artifacts from the Historical Society. Welcome, John.
Welcome, thank you.
I'm so excited to listen to this story.
It's a very interesting story.
Excellent. Let's go.
Getting back to the Stone Tavern, that was by the roadside, halfway up the hill. It played an important role in the early life of the town. It was there that balls were held in its hall. So I've never been in the building, but I assume it has a large hall. And there was also a great supper that was served on the evening of the town's election. When the ball was held, the people assembled at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and they danced until daylight the next morning. So it was an all-nighter. All the guests in attendance wore their finest clothes. Many came by horseback. The colonel of the town's militia always led off the dancing. The fiddler made the music and called out the changes in the dances. Toddy was frequently passed during the evening, so that was interesting. And a turkey dinner was served at midnight. As the night wore on, the dances became merrier and their tongues were freer. I think that might have something to do with the toddy. But
Definitely.
it was then that the fiddler called out for the fancy dance steps, such as the pigeon wing and the double shuffle. Are you a dancer?
I am not.
Oh.
The pigeon wing sounds a lot like the chicken dance.
Yeah, I don't know. The double shuffle. There had to be something to do with your feet. You had to do something. But anyways, yeah. But they must have known what the pigeon wing is and the double shuffle.
Yep.
So this hilarity continued until the cocks began to crow and the new day dawned. Lest you get the wrong idea that the balls were confined to the more worldly, lest you get the idea that the balls were confined to the more, lest you get the wrong idea, the balls were confined to the more worldly people of the community. It was considered a great sin and an occasion for severe penance if a church member were to attend one. In every village at those times, there was a person who acted as the guardian of the affairs of the townspeople. This person was known as the village oracle. And in Hopkinton, Aunt Pugh was that person. She knew everyone's business and advised in all matters, great and small. Aunt Pugh had by nature wise judgment, a keen wit, and the kindest heart. Everyone sought her counsel and advice. She kept herself and her home neat and clean. She grew flowers in the garden, fed her chickens, and milked the cow. She also had a bed of fennel and caraway seeds growing under the eaves of a low-hanging roof at the back of her house. Aunt Pugh thought it was wise to go to Sunday meetings with fennel and caraway in the event she would become drowsy in the midst of the minister's sermon. Nodding during the sermon was to be avoided at all costs. So that'll give you an idea of what it must have been like to sit there for 2 hours.
And then another 2 hours.
And then another 2 hours.
In the summer without air conditioning.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You know what? You got to be working hard living that time of life.
So, religion was a big deal.
Yeah.
Very big deal. So Mary Claflin in her book talks about what I thought was an amusing story about Aunt Pugh and Madam Price. Madam Price was a descendant of the late Roger Price, and he lived in a mansion quite near the meeting house. And this is a picture that shows the meeting house and the Price Manor mansion. See, they were close together. Madam Price was a very attractive woman who always maintained an English lifestyle. The plantings and shrubbery around her home, particularly her lilacs, were the envy of the entire village. One morning on her way to church, Aunt Pugh couldn't resist the temptation to break off a branch of lilacs and affix them to her hat. She wanted to make herself look really attractive.
Yeah.
She knew that Madam Price would already be at the head of her pew in the church, and that she would be none the wiser about the loss of the lilac, blossom. So, feeling good about herself, Aunt Pugh began to march up the wide aisle of the church to her pew, but had not gotten very far when she heard the children giggling and a noise coming from the tithing man. Then the minister also cast a glance at her. With all this attention, she quickly slunk into the corner of her pew. And during the first long prayer, when all the faithful had their eyes closed, she removed the offending blossom from her hat and placed it in the sawdust box at the back of the church door. Madam Price never found out who broke off the branch of her cherished lilac bush. Near the end of the book, Mary included a chapter dealing with what she calls strange people. Here she tells stories about a number of interesting personalities who once lived in town. I've included a few of these stories that really need to be told. The first one is about Miss Hanscom, who lived near the meeting house and spent most of her time either reading the Bible or going to church. She lived in a little red house with the paint mostly washed off. Her garden was barren, and she had no eye for personal beauty. Every worldly interest of hers was subservient to reading the Bible and going to meeting. Oftentimes, she would take her laundry or baking needs to a neighbor's home so they could converse on biblical topics while they did their housework. She could recite all the books of the Bible from Genesis to Revelations. Sunday was the greatest day of the week for her. The ladies always watched Miss Hanscom enter the church. She walked with a slow, pious gait to the very last pew. At the noon break, she would spend her time in the church graveyard, walking among the mounds and meditating on the end of her earthly life. Her food for Sundays was always prepared on Saturday nights to avoid having to work on the Sabbath day. Miss Hanscom had a brother who had the mental capacity equal to her own, but his inclinations led him in a completely different direction. He was the village wag, they called him, the butt of the boys and the terror of the girls as he wandered about. He slept in barns and sheds, wherever he may be at nightfall, and he begged for his daily bread and for a glass of cider to drink. Cider was the chief delight of his life, and he would do almost anything to get it. For a mug of cider, he would walk 2 or 3 miles to do an errand for a neighbor. He knew a lot about herbs, and sometimes he would gather sassafras and wintergreen and catnip and bring these to the good doctor with a request to swap them for a mug of cider. He never went to the meeting house, and he called his sister stupid because she spent so much time there. Another of the strange characters of the time was Billy Buck. He was a pauper who considered himself the town orator. He would roam about the village making speeches in the most grandiose language whenever he could find 2 or 3 people together on a street corner or in a little shop that would listen to him. If he was unable to find any listeners, he would stand before a cornfield and for an hour or more and address the corn stalks using the same grandiose language. He would become so excited with his oratory that he would wipe tears from his eyes and exclaim in a loud voice, "Glory to Gideon, my hearers." Poor old Billy lived and died in the village almshouse and was buried in a pauper's grave. Regardless of being poor, he always thought of himself as a patrician of the first order. So what do you think about Billy Buck?
You know, I mean, like every age, every generation has their interesting, quirky people. I think it's really fascinating to hear of these people from the early 1800s, you know, doing quirky things that we would think the same of today, but really personalizes them.
The town oracle for me is, well, this town today is too big to have one person that is the know-all for the whole town.
Yeah.
But that doesn't change. That doesn't change. There are people that like to know everybody's business.
Right.
And
yeah. And you know, these people were English, so they were used to living under nobility, and you know, they had absolute rule. And now they're in a free land. But to me, that, you know, the town oracle sounds kind of like a throwback from their English roots. Yeah. Not that I know.
So the next person I want to talk about is Jack Downs. He's the village jester. He's the joker. So Jack was a half-wit. He was a do-nothing fellow whose whole business in life was to make both the young and the old merry. And his favorite place to do this was to enact a comedy in the church. So anyways, one Sunday, as he was sitting in the front row of the gallery, remember he's upstairs now because he's not qualified to be down with the other people, he fashioned a pin into a fish hook and was lowering it down to catch the wig of an old man who was sitting directly below him. When the minister stopped his sermon and chastised Jack, Jack continued on with his fishing and coolly replied to the minister, "Mind your preaching, mind your preaching. I am a fisher of men." There's also in the book is a discussion about a family of 5 peculiar brothers and their wives and their children, known as the Smith tribe. You probably have heard of the Smiths, the Smith family.
Yes.
Yeah, you have. Yeah, Godsmith. You've heard of that?
Oh, that one I haven't. No, I just heard of the
Smith.
Smiths.
Okay. Well, anyways, the Smith. They lived in the village. There were 5 brothers: Joe, Aaron, Bill, Moses, and Nat Smith. Nat was the oldest and was called Godsmith, as he always wore a hat, and on this hat there was a band that contained the words, "I am God." The tribe was opposed to all existing forms of religion, but they had their own unique traditions. One of their customs was to march around the old meeting house 7 times each week blowing a trumpet. So I assume this was not on Sunday because that would have raised a riot.
Yep.
But and God Smith always led that ceremony. The Smiths had other customs too. They opposed all marriage ceremonies. Funeral services were performed only among themselves with no minister in attendance, and each Smith family was permitted to only have 1 child. The last of the strange people that I want to talk about is Hannah Adams. Hannah lived in Boston, and she was a teacher in the school in Hopkinton. So she would take the stagecoach back and forth every day, carrying with her a great bag of books. In the school, there was an hourglass, which was the only way of telling time. There was no clocks in the wall. Yeah. I mean, this was before electricity. So the time was taken by the hourglass. But often Hannah would become so deeply involved with one of her abstract subjects that she was teaching or talking about, she would lose complete awareness of what the time was and of the fact there were students there. When this happened, the students would take the hourglass and turn it either up or down as needed so that they could get released from school an hour earlier. So they set the hourglass so it would run out quicker. Children in those days enjoyed their leisure time very differently than they do today. There were no picnics, no parties, no games, and that type of thing. Sometimes, if they were good, a little girl or boy would be told they could go to the good doctor and have an aching tooth pulled out. Dentists were unknown at that time. The doctor used a special instrument for extracting the teeth and was so kindly in his ways that the little children never feared him. The penny he always had at the ready was a panacea for the pain caused by the extraction or for the unpleasantness of the medicine he administered. So you got a penny.
Yeah.
If you went to the doctor to get a tooth pulled.
Wow.
Apothecaries and pharmacies didn't exist at that time. And all the drugs necessary for treatment of pain had to be carried by the good doctor in a box that was either affixed to his carriage or in his saddlebag. So he would go by carriage, horse and carriage, to go to a sick person, or if he couldn't do that, he would have to ride on horseback to go. So he had the medicines in the saddlebag or in a box in the carriage. Medicines in those days were Elixir Pro, salts, Senna, paregoric. I remember paregoric as a kid, and castor oil and the like. In the springtime, the great event for the women was the making of soap and also a thorough cleaning of their house after the long, dreary winter. Summer was the busiest time of the year for the women, especially the ladies of the best families, because they often attended formal afternoon teas in their best black silk gowns. Candle making was the great housekeeping event in the fall of the year, as candles were the only source of light during the long winter evenings. And every home in town needed candles. They brought good cheer, and they were absolutely necessary for light. A funeral was a major event in the village. The meeting house bell would always announce the departure of a person by its solemn tolling. The bell was rung 3 times for the death of a child, 6 times for that of a woman, and 9 times for a man that passed on. The age of the deceased was then peeled out slowly, 1 ring at a time for each year of age. This alerted the entire village that a funeral was soon to take place and that the necessary preparations and kindly deeds were then in order. After reading Mary's book, I stopped to reflect on it and what it meant and what the early life in Hopkinton was like. And my first thought was people then were extremely religious, and the meeting house was of utmost importance to them. Secondly, most of the people were poor, and farming was their chief occupation. But the most important facet that I thought, was that the townspeople cared for their neighbors, and not just by words of encouragement, but by doing acts of love and mercy when they were needed or appropriate. So I hope you enjoyed this true story, and I emphasize true, and I would be most interested in hearing from you. The best way you could do this would be to send a note to Jim Cousins at HCAM. Thank you for watching. And Jim, if you had to, after listening to this, if you had to say what your reactions were, what would you say?
I would have to say that Mary is kind of like Hopkinton's Laura Ingalls.
Okay.
She just put life down at that point in time.
Yeah.
And it's so far away from what we do now.
Yeah.
It's like really fascinating.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting.
Yeah. The church, I think the thing that's most unusual probably is the time the people devoted to going to church, praying.
Yep.
That was the center of their life.
Right. And how intertwined the church was with just regular life.
Yeah.
I believe that was a congregational church.
That was the congregational church.
And they still have the records in their histories from this time period. It's really fascinating.
I know this is a little off the subject, but I understand the congregational church, or the
Faith community.
The Faith Community Church is going to have some kind of a history show about their history.
Yes.
Because they were in the Historical Society getting some material of ours for their presentation about the history.
Yes.
And I think that's going to be very interesting.
Yes. Yeah, they have a big anniversary coming up. All right. So, John, thank you so much for taking the time. This is the end of our the second episode in this series of 2. So we hope that you enjoyed it, and we hope that you come back and check out more of Hidden Treasures.